Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list. This time around we are going to be covering the Warriors of Chaos and where their various units stand in the multiplayer scene. Now, this is a roster that has not seen any changes since the last video we did. They have not received any new characters, any new units, none of that stuff. So same material to deal with, though it should be said that, of course, the meta as overall has shifted. There have been certain units that have improved, certain characters that have been improved, certain units and characters that have been downgraded a little bit. And that might certainly see them, and of course other factions have received buffs and nerfs in that time period as well, which has made Chaos builds a bit different. That certainly means Chaos has had to adjust some of their builds in certain scenarios where before they had sort of meta comps they would always run with. But regardless, we're going to be diving in, starting things off with the bringer of the end times, and that is Archaeon, the Ever-Chosen. And this is an excellent lord. He's gone up a lot, and he's got great combat stats. He's the only source of immunity psychology Chaos has. As a roster, Chaos lacks immunity psychology on most units. They've got a few with frenzy. So you have, for example, the Forsaken, who do get frenzy. You do have unbreakable units like Chaos Spawn, and of course units that cause fear or terror of their own. But by and large, the Chaos roster is susceptible to psychology. Even Chaos Knights and Chosen do not have immunity to psychology, though Chaos Knights at least do cause fear. And that does mean that those units can potentially be terror routed. And Archaeon can negate that with his Crown of Domination, which gives him AoE plus 4 leadership and, more importantly, immunity to psychology. Makes him great with trolls. He's got Lore of Fire, which is a very respectable lore of magic. Lets you burn through mobs of infantry, lets you spam fireballs to counteract enemy artillery. He himself is a respectable combatant, very, very solid, high HP pool, physical resist. With the Slayer of Kings, he becomes an absolute monstrosity. You can drop Cascading Fire Cloak and Slayer of Kings on him, and his damage output skyrockets into, I believe, well into the 800s, if not over 900 damage per swing, which is pretty insane. He can chunk certain characters very quickly. Tomb King Lords, beware if he happens to drop some fire damage on himself. Can punish ethereal characters very effectively, that sort of thing. That said, he's not without his downsides. He is a bit easy to block since he's limited to Dorgar or Foot. He's definitely not a character who can always get the matchups he wants. He can't always reach the fights he wants to be in. He is a bit of an expensive character. Obviously, those stats and that magic comes at a cost, and Archaeon, especially with a decent kit, is a very expensive lord to bring to the field. So certainly not in the top tier of expense, certainly not on par with, say, Imric, but or Luther or something, but he is a very, very pricey lord to put on the field, and it can be a bit of an issue if you want to go wider. So he's going to get himself an A tier. There's also the issue of competitive other competitive lords. Chaos has a lot of competition on their roster, so Archaeon is going to name himself an A tier here. But he is an excellent lord choice, really solid in probably the majority of Chaos matchups, and in fact might be the most competitive lord Chaos has as far as having a diverse lineup of matchups he can be good in. Because the other two that are going to be up here with him are a bit more niche, I would say. Next up, Kolek, the mountain god himself. Yeah, another easy A tier. Unlike Archaeon, who brings a mix of magic and combat prowess and support, even if a bit limited support, Kolek does none of that. He just comes in to smack some fools. He's got a very high HP pool. He's got baked-in missile resist, respectable armor, great mobility. He's a large single entity that causes terror, so he can tear out enemies out of position. He can beat the snot out of enemy large single entities very, very easily. If you happen to bring Star Crusher, he'll do so even quicker, though usually you won't bother paying for Star Crusher, but with it he gets really insane. Without it, he's a very, very powerful combat lord. And of course he does have his Lord of the Storm. He can call down thunderbolt from the sky, and that will do a decent amount of damage to a blobbed up clump of infantry or cavalry, or if you actually nail a single entity, I believe it does decent damage to those two, though that is a very, very unlikely proposition. But yeah, Kolek, it's a very simplistic situation. Unlike Archaeon, who just brings so much to the table, Kolek is just beats the crap out of large entities. And that is very valuable in matchups like Lizardmen, in matchups like High Elves where you might face Star Dragon mounted lords. In matchups such as Bretonia, he can be an absolute terror because he beats the crap out of their cavalry and their lords. Against Empire, even, if you can protect him from missile play, he can beat the snot out of, say, Karl Franz or Boris Todbringer. And so on and so forth. So in many matchups, he is a very, very solid choice. Obviously not something you want to bring against, say, Vampire Ghost or against Wood Elves. Definitely not the Lord of Choice to bring there, though you can do against Wood Elves sometimes. But nowadays, it's Sisters and ranged poke is definitely not as good there. But Lord, you maybe don't want to bring against Dwarves or Vampire Ghost, I should say. But in many matchups, he can bring a big punch to the table, and that's really what matters. That's really what he's all about, is, beat the brakes off large characters. Next up, we do have Sorcerer, the Ever Chicken, and he's also getting an A tier, and, I would put him a little bit lower than Archaeon, perhaps about on par with Kolek. Really, all these guys are very, very excellent characters. I just don't think anyone is outright stronger overall than the others. Sorcerer, the Ever Chicken, of course, mixed caster and combat lord. He does get the Lore of Metal, which is a very solid lore. You get Plague of Rust, which can make your non-AP options such as Chaos Warriors, Chosen, Chaos Knights, and Chaos Spawn or Marauder Horseman perform excellently against armored targets. He gets the final transmutation, of course. So if your opponent thinks they're going to be clever and blob on you as Chaos, yeah, he can punish that hard. For example, if your opponent brings a demi-blob with Franz, you can punish that very, very effectively with the Ever Chicken. That said, his missile resist, which was once sort of his crowning tool, has been reduced. It's gone down from 60% to 50%, and while that might not seem like a lot, it does mean he now takes essentially 20% more damage than he once did. Before he'd only take 40%, or now he takes 50%. It's a tangible increase in how much damage he takes, and he is much more vulnerable to non-magical missiles nowadays. Magic missiles still kind of suck against him because he's got that magic resist as well. So, for example, the Hammer of Witches does only 25% of its damage against him. If your opponent tries to cast magic missiles like Vindictive Glare or whatever, it's going to do nothing to Sorcerer, basically. He just shrugs it off and flies around like mad. Of course, he's unbreakable, just like other demonic characters such as Ariel or Orion. So he has to be killed till he's dead. Decent combatant, though certainly not top tier. Somewhere above Ariel, I would say, certainly, but not a top tier combat lord. Certainly not on par with, say, Archaeon or Kolek, but does hit fairly hard, has a respectable weapon strength, has magic damage, fairly high offensive stats, fairly high HP, and does have some janky animations and movements that can occasionally help him get out of a tough spot. So very, very solid lord option. Brings some good support to the table with magic, causes fear, causes terror, and all in all, nice character to have for Chaos. And the final legendary lord, the salacious Scion of Slaanesh here. Good old Sigvald. And Sigvald's moved up a lot. I was actually incredibly generous on my last tier list when I put him, I believe, at C tier. I'm actually going to put, and really, he probably should have been a D tier at the time. But in this list, I'm going to put him towards the top of B tier. And that is because Sigvald has come a long way. The last patch gave him immunity to Vigor. He got some much improved combat itemization. He got, for example, the Hero Killing Blow, so he's now much more effective at dishing out damage. He's incredibly cheap for how insanely high his stats are. You compare him to something like Wulfric on foot, and his stats are bonkers. Very, very cheap, very efficient lord, very survivable, and in a late game scenario can beat the snot out of most targets. His Auric Armor will, of course, keep him sustained throughout a fight. He's fairly tanky. I don't put him up at A tier because he's not a win condition the way, for example, Kolek or Sorcerer can be. He doesn't bring quite as much utility to the table. Certainly, he's not as flexible of a lord as any of these three. However, he can be very oppressive. If you didn't bring something that can kill Sigvald efficiently, then he can be a problem because you're not going to kill him with generic run-of-the-mill infantry. Missiles don't do that well against him because he's got a silver shield. So in a late game scenario, if you're just down to a handful of units and some crippled heroes or something, he will carry the day because he's got perfect vigor and he's got borderline unbreakable leadership. If you don't trigger army losses, Sigvald can be very difficult to finish off. So he's going to get himself a B tier. I think his lack of presence in an early game scenario definitely hurts Sigvald. It makes him less appealing than these three, but there are certainly matchups where he can perform excellently. Dwarves, Coast, Wood Elves, factions like that, he can do really, really well for himself. And really, he's, believe it or not, this, in my opinion at least, the lineup of Legendary Lords for Chaos is a lot tighter. Is actually a really, really tight matchup. Even though Sigvald might be a separate tier for me, I think he's actually pretty strong. Which brings us on to a Lord that's not very strong, and actually our first F tier, the Chaos Lord. Yeah, he's just bad. That might sound a little harsh. It might sound a little too much, but honestly, he's just a bad Lord. His only gimmick over other combat lords is that he has a dragon, so you can get a flying lord. But if you want a dragon, you're going to bring Chaos Sorcerer. He brings no real support to the table. He's a terrible foot character because Siggy is just way better, especially now. If you want cheap and cheerful, you're going to bring a Chaos Sorcerer once again, because Chaos mages are pretty dang expensive. Chaos, and we're going to get into that in a little bit, but the Chaos Sorcerer is not cheap. It's a fairly expensive caster, so when you pay for a lord, you still do have to pay for that additional caster cost on top of that. So it's not actually as cheap as they just bring Chaos Sorcerer Lord. So this guy's just gonna get himself an F tier. He doesn't really bring much to the table. Yeah, you can try some gimmicky, super wide builds maybe if you just bring this guy butt naked and throw in a super stripped down caster. But honestly, what he brings to the table, you're better off if you want a horse character. You got Archaeon. If you want a big terror-causing monster, Kolek or Throil, or a caster on a dragon are way better. And if you just want cheap and tanky, Sigvald, way to go. I seriously don't think this guy's much of a purpose, and it's kind of sad, but hopefully he gets buffed and improved in the future. Chaos Sorcerer Lord, however, another solid pick, and I'm actually going to give him a B tier alongside Sigvald. I think he's very solid. The Lore of Magic selection isn't the greatest. You get Death, Fire, Metal, and Shadows. None of those are bad lords. All of them are solid lords, to be honest. But obviously, it's a limited selection. It's not ideal. You would prefer to have a broader selection, no matter how you cut it. So that is definitely a bit of a downside. You've obviously got no healing. Itemization's all right on this guy. The Blasted Standard can give you some missile parry hilarity if you combine it with Chosen, because he buffs him up to 72% shields, but kind of a niche item there. And besides that, you've got the Sword of Anti-Airs, which can give you a bit of punch if you're on a dragon, especially. You can put this guy on a dragon. The Chaos Dragon's a bit iffy due to animations, especially. But if you happen to want those breath attacks, if you want that mobile terror, and maybe you don't want Lore of Metal, which is what you're locked into with Sorcerer, this guy can be pretty juicy. He can be a solid support option. And definitely is competing in there, especially because he has two lords that you don't get access to. Sorcerer and Archaeon are both strong, but perhaps you want some Terror Causer that doesn't just have Lore of Metal, and in that case, this guy's definitely pretty strong. Or perhaps you just want a very, very cheap caster lord, and you just want that super wide army. Both Archaeon and Sorcerer cost quite a lot, so even Archaeon or Sorcerer, even stripped down to the bare necessities, you're talking about a 2,000 gold character. Whereas you can get a Sorcerer quite a couple hundred beneath that, get a broader build, maybe cram in an extra unit of Chaos Warriors or some Horsemen or something like that, and just have him on a horse with some like 1 or 2 spells, and it's a very, very efficient caster option. So for me, he gets a B tier. Once again, isn't quite as powerful, isn't quite as much of a win condition necessarily as some of the other lords, but brings a lot of utility to the table. Easy B. Now the vanilla Chaos Sorcerer is kind of an caster. Much like I'm going to give him a C tier. For me, the main issue is that Chaos already has 2 caster legendary lords plus their lord option caster, and all of them are essentially top tier picks. None of them are a bad caster choice. So immediately there's a chance that you don't even need a Chaos Sorcerer to begin with. And if you do, this is a fairly expensive character. He's got great combat stats. He's got good armor, or I should say great combat stats for caster. And he's got good armor, which does make him a little resilient to miscasts. But he does have horrific itemization with the Forbidden Rod, which just does not synergize with him at all, since he doesn't regen like the Necromancer. for vampire counts. And while he does have solid lore magic, your selection, same as the Chaos Sorcerer Lord, you are limited in the selection. It is still only 4 lores, and it's a very expensive caster for it. You're paying a few hundred more than you would, for example, for an Empire Mage, or even a High Elf Mage, or a Dark Elf Mage, who are some of the more expensive casters because they're paying for Martial Mastery and that sort of thing, or Martial Prowess and that sort of thing. So unfortunately, the Chaos Sorcerer just kind of falls off. I think he's just a bit too expensive for what he does. Obviously, a mandatory choice almost if you bring Kolek or Sigvald, but yeah, not really sort of a top tier caster pick, and it's one I think you really got to compare it outside of the faction as well. He's just not that good of a caster, but in a pinch, occasionally he can put out some hurt, which can be nice. So there are definitely situations where that's nifty. Exalted Hero, another one I'm going to put down at C tier. It's a character I bashed quite heavily in my last video, I believe, and a character I personally was not fond of, but after giving him more of a spin and testing him out a bit more, this guy does have his niche uses. Give him a Manticore mount and he can beat some cheap, reliable terror, decent combatant in the skies. Give him a horse, and he can actually be a disruptive ground presence. He can run around and against Skaven weapon teams, for example, lay the smackdown on him. He can smack down enemy characters pretty well. He's got fairly high weapon strength and fairly solid combat stats, good armor. All in all, a very respectable lord or character. Just kind of limited. Doesn't bring any utility to the table. It's just a straight beat 'em up character option who can upgrade himself with Frenzy and the Hellfire Sword. So definitely a bit limited in his usage. Definitely not something you're going to be bringing in every or even most matchups, but a character who can perform okay in specific circumstances. And if you build around them, can definitely be part of a Chaos Goon squad, for example. Which does bring us on to Chaos Infantry. And Chaos Infantry is a lineup that, in my opinion, I don't know if it suffers, but definitely highlights Chaos's issues with just redundancy. Chaos Infantry is perhaps one of the most linear and one of the most complete infantry lineups in the entire game. You essentially have a variant of everything. You've got great weapons, you've got halberds, you've got sword and board in 3 separate tiers. The only missing thing is a low tier halberd or polearm. So the result is that Chaos, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the result is that Chaos tends to hyper specialize. So where on another roster, you might have to bring, for example, white lines for high elves don't really have a huge amount of competition. You're not going to they're essentially a unit you're going to bring in a multitude of different matchups, even if they aren't necessarily exactly what you want, just because you have no other choice. In Chaos's choice, if you're looking at great weapons, you can choose Chosen great weapons, you can choose Chaos Warrior great weapons, you can choose Marauder great weapons. And depending on what matchup you're in, depending on what targets you're expecting to face, what the exact situation calls for, you can customize your build. You can't do that as High Elves, for example. And you absolutely cannot do that as a faction like Empire. You cannot do that as a faction like Lizardmen, for example. You're locked into Temple Guard. That's your only elite choice. Whereas Chaos, if they're looking at elites, they have 3 different Chosen variants to choose from. Stuff like that. So regardless, we're going to dive in Marauders. Based on some of your feedback in previous videos, guys, I'm actually going to put these guys as S tier. I didn't do this for some of the prior chaff units, like for example, Vampire Coast Zombies, but some of you guys did bring up some very good points that those are units you basically see in every matchup. And honestly, it's true for Marauders. Marauders are a unit you will basically see in every matchup if you're facing Chaos. They're cheap filler that moves pretty quick, disrupts backlines pretty well, has a shield, soaks damage. They trade fairly well into, say, Sword and Board Infantry. They'll trade efficiently into, say, Eternal Guard or High Elf Spear, so they actually don't win those fights. They trade efficiently into Empire Swordsmen. They'll actually beat Empire Swordsmen, who ironically beat High Elf Spears and Eternal Guard. So some fun rock, paper, scissors there. But Marauder's just a very efficient swarming unit. Not quite as good as Norscan Marauders, I will say, but within the context of the Chaos roster, they are still an S tier. Obviously, the Chaos Marauders with Rage are just another tier better. They'd be like an S. Like if they were a Chaos roster, these guys would probably tank to an F tier because you'd never bring them. You'd bring the Chaos Norscan Marauders. But in the context of Chaos, Marauders are vanilla Marauders here, S tier. Same cannot be said for Marauder Great Weapons. Unfortunately, despite their cost buffs, I still don't think they're a very good unit. I think they net themselves somewhere between a high D and a low C tier. I'm going to give them a low C. As this roster fills it out, they're probably going to drop further. But they're a low C. A unit that, generally, if you want great weapons, you're going to bring Chaos Warriors. They're only... they're only 375 gold. Well, I say only 375. That's actually an entire Marauder difference in cost. But they're 375 gold more, but you get way more tankiness, way more leadership, and way more combat stats, way more reliability. These guys take a nasty cavalry charge, and where, for example, Chaos Warrior Great Weapons, they can tank a charge from Empire Knights, and they will beat the brakes off those Empire Knights if your opponent doesn't micro them out right away. If your opponent charges some Empire Knights into Chaos Marauders, they will take a major hurt, and while they might come back swinging a little bit, the amount of damage you took initially is going to be brutal, and you're not going to be bouncing back from that all happy-go-lucky. So, unfortunately, a very flimsy unit, very squishy to missile fire, very squishy to any sort of blasting charges or something like that, very squishy to cavalry. There's nothing these guys are resilient against. They don't trade that well into armor either, just because their combat stats aren't that good. But there are certain matchups where you want swarmy AP unit in kind of the same sense that the Lizardmen bring red-crested skinks. And so I'm going to give a C tier here, very low C, high D. Aspiring Champions, on the other hand, I actually really enjoy. This is a unit that, for me, has spiked into my love for them. Before, I would have rated them really lowly. But at the moment, I actually think they're a rather solid and, in fact, underrated unit. For 550 gold, you essentially get a micro unit of Chosen. And if you envision these guys as essentially half a unit of Chosen, these guys do perform comparably. Now, they've got less models than Chosen. They don't dish out as much damage as, say, half a unit of Chosen would. But they are tankier per model. They are a bit cheaper, in fact, than half a unit of Chosen. They do magic damage, which is fairly rare on the Chaos roster. And they provide a bit of a leadership aura, which can be useful if your lord's up and away somewhere else. And they just hold and beat down and grind down cheap trash fairly efficiently. And unlike Chosen, they don't give your opponent one meaty target. They can swarm over your opponent a bit better. They're a bit quicker. They can cover more ground. And yeah, they're essentially half a unit of Chosen. And they're a bit more vulnerable to, say, single entities than Chosen are, just because they tend to take the full brunt of an attack on a single model, which is not ideal. But for me, they're a low B nowadays. They definitely have their usage. I like using them against spammy infantry factions because they basically do the job Chosen would do without being vulnerable to, say, death globes or poison wind globes or poison wind mortars. They're not as vulnerable to the anti-infantry tools you might see brought to the field against Chosen. And yeah, fairly resilient buggers who will slowly but surely grind your opponent under. They're good fun. For 550 gold, they're a solid unit. Forsaken, unfortunately, I don't think I can say the same thing. They're a decent unit in their own right, but I think they are, and I was kind of mentioned it in the Fixing the Forgotten video, they're a little underperforming still. They're just very, very fragile, very flimsy for how much you're paying for them. Usually, I think you prefer Chaos Warriors. They're just very, very easy to beat down. And for me, they're going to get themselves a high C. I just like Aspiring Champions better. These guys, I know a lot of people would probably disagree, but I actually like Aspiring Champions as a stable but super cheap anchor that can cover a lot of ground because you can bring a lot of them. Forsaken, you can bring a swarm of. They can be decent against, say, Empire. They can be decent against Wood Elves if you do a full-blown rush. They've got their uses. They're not a terrible unit. But they do suffer a little bit from fragility, and I think they could use some slight tweaks in that department. But yeah, in a handful of matchups as a full rush option, they're definitely not bad, and can really break down a line quickly. If they come to grips with your Bretonnian trash spam or with your Empire State Troops, your Wood Elf front line, it's not lasting long against Forsaken. Chaos Warriors, however, definitely a much better choice. For them, they're really, really solid. I'm going to give them a B tier here, a higher B tier, where Aspiring Champs, you know what, I'll give Aspiring Champs a high C. These guys, I do think Chaos Warriors are a bit more reliable. Chaos Warriors trade rather well into most unarmored targets. They have silver shields. They're kind of a slow and steady wins the race, grindy unit. You're not going to bring them into every matchup. because in some matchups you're going to bring Chosen, in some matchups, in a lot of matchups you're going to bring the Mirror Guard. Ultimately, they are once again competing for that hyper specialized slot with the Force of Chaos, and so they're not something you're going to bring in a majority of matchups. But against, say, Wood Elves, they can be very solid. Against Tomb Kings, they can be very respectable. Against Empire, they can be very, very efficient. Against Vampire Coast, they can be very efficient. There's just a multitude of matchups where these guys can perform rather well. And for me, they get a B tier. Going on to Chaos Warriors with great weapons. Actually, similar case to Chaos Warriors. They're a good unit. They are, for their cost, an excellent great weapon. Tanky, good combat stats, good weapon strength. Just a bit slow, which is just the trend with Chaos Infantry. That's upper tier. They're all slow, and that can result in some nasty kiting situations. But I would put them a little bit above Chaos Warriors with shields. I think they're a little more consistent as a core great weapon unit. They're good against High Elves. They're good against Dwarves. They're good against Tomb Kings once again. Actually, they're good against Lizardmen. They can be solid there. They're just a solid all-around great weapon. You can bring them against Empire, of course. Generally against Bretonia, you'll prefer the Halberds, which I think are the low end of the B tier. I think the Halberds are the least useful of the Chaos Warriors. I think they're a unit you're going to bring against, like, specifically Bretonia. Maybe a handful. I'm trying to think. I wouldn't really bring them against Lizardmen, because against Lizardmen you want Chaos Warriors with great weapons to crush down the Saurus Warriors that you're probably going to be seeing, or there's a good chance you'll be seeing. And unfortunately, against factions like Tomb Kings or Vampire, for example, Vampire Counts, these guys don't quite hold that well as Chosen Halberds would. So I think they're going to net themselves a low B, probably the lowest B tier on this list, maybe. But still a very respectable unit, and I really don't think this makes Chaos Warrior Halberds bad. They're just out-niched, essentially. Which does bring us on to Chosen, and Chosen I love, Chosen I adore. Take these pasty mid-tier troops and throw them in the garbage, because the elites are here to play. But no, this is a tough one. Chosen overlap quite a bit with Chaos Warriors. They're just Chaos Warriors, but better, essentially. And you pay more for that, obviously. But I do prefer them in some ways. Chaos Warriors Chosen with Axe and Shield, I think are a bit better than Chaos Warriors with Axe and Shield for what they do. There are a handful of matchups where I wouldn't bring these guys, so probably about, I guess, tied. They're better against factions, like, for example, Dwarves. You can bring a unit of Chosen with a Plague of Rustcaster, and the amount of damage Chosen can crank out when a target loses its armor is insane. So it actually gives them a bit of a niche, where Chaos Warriors, you're just swarming with them. They don't give you sort of a hard core unit. It doesn't give you a strong anchor unit. It doesn't give you a unit that is going to win the fights before it. So there's not really a huge benefit to hitting a target with Plague of Rust for your Chaos Warriors to beat it down. Whereas it's Chosen, they synergize very well with that. They will do well against Dwarves. They're a bit tankier to blasting charges because they've got less model count, more HP per model. Less good against, say, Vampire Coast. They can still perform well against Wood Elves, actually. They're just so grindy. Can still do okay against Tomb Kings, though certainly not quite as well. Now that I think about it, maybe overall, I'll put them down to slightly lower B than Sword and Board Chaos Warriors, because I think there's some matchups where artillery play really does threaten these guys in a way that it doesn't threaten Chaos Warriors as much, but still an excellent unit. I like them against Empire, for example, because they can just grind down everything Empire has in the infantry department. There's literally nothing Empire has that beats these guys in a 1v1, if infantry-wise. So they can be a big problem there. Just a single unit is borders on being a Mortis engine that will just slowly chew away all your infantry. If you can protect them from cavalry, especially. But yeah, just a very stable anchor. If your opponent doesn't have splash artillery to quickly delete them. Chosen Halberds, excellent unit, and they're going to get up here, not so much because they're a unit that you see in a lot of matchups, but more because they're a unit that you see in dominate in a handful of matchups. Against Vampire counts, they're very, very solid. They're an excellent unit against Bretonnia. For Bretonnia, these guys are nightmare fuel. And then those are really the two key matchups, in my opinion, for these guys. They can do rather well against Lizardmen, though there's an argument there for Chosen with great weapons. They can... should mention Dark Elves in all of this. The shielded variants of Chosen can actually perform rather well. I don't know if you guys know this, but Chosen with sword and board will actually outfight Hargoneth Executioners without Murderous Prowess. So they will even counter their supposed counters. You drop a Plague of Rust, for example, on Hargoneth Executioners, these guys will chew them under. And with their 60% shields, they can actually shrug off a decent amount of missile pressure that Dark Elves usually field against you. And they can actually be a decent unit in matchups like that, too. Also have excellent synergy, I should mention, with the Chaos Spawn Regiment round. But, yeah, Chaos Chosen Halberds, excellent unit in a handful of matchups. Very specific matchups. Obviously, unshielded, not the best damage output against infantry, but if you just need a stable anchor that will hold the line against big targets that don't have great AP missile support, these guys are your go-to. They will do amazing work. Really, Bretonnia and... Vampire counts, they are such a good unit. Excellent. Tough for Beastmen to deal with too, in fact, though Beastmen don't have great tools against any of the Chosen, really. It's just kind of kite and poke and try to cycle charge with Chariots, but Chosen Halberds do pretty well there too, in fact, if you can deal with Cygors and Centaurs. So easy sort of upper mid B for them. Chosen great weapons are also going to get themselves a high spot. Now, I personally really like Chosen with sword and board, so for me personally, they'd probably be a bit higher, but overall, I think Chosen great weapons are probably the best of the bunch here. In fights against Black Orcs and fights against Dwarves, they can do very well there. They can do rather well against High Elves. They're an absolute nightmare for High Elves to deal with. Good against Norska. I should mention, actually, Chosen Halberds are really good against Norska too. These guys are good against Norska. They can be utilized, honestly, against Empire. Once again, if you screen them correctly, they can do well against a lot of factions. You just don't want to bring them against, say, Wood Elves or Vampire Coast. Probably not the biggest brain move there. Probably not ideal to bring them against, say, Dark Elves. But against Lizardmen, they can really do well. I think they're probably the most universal of the Chosen. Perhaps even a bit more universal than Chaos Warriors. It's a bit of a toss-up here. But all in all, I rate all these high tier elites as a solid B. Which does move us on to the Mirror Guard, and I think the Mirror Guard actually gets itself up to a low A tier, and that is because they're a fairly universal Regiment of Renown. They're Chaos Warriors. They're essentially a unit that hangs between Chaos Warriors and Chosen, which is all well and good. They give you a bit of a mid-tier choice of shielded infantry, but importantly, they've got 38 speed. Which is huge. All these other units are too slow to catch certain units. So, for example, against Skaven, you'll just get kited. Even Dwarf missiles can kite you. Can't do that against the Mirror Guard. And that's actually a big point for Mirror Guard, is that they're very mobile. They can function very well as an anchor for a Marauder rush. They got immune psychology, and they have fast speed. Big old win for them. Big old reason why they're up at A tier here instead of B tier with all the other Chaos Warrior units. Because if they were the same speed as these guys, they would definitely drop to B tier. They'd just be another sword and board filler. Moving on to the Forsaken Regiment of Renown, they're going to get themselves a low B, mostly because they are a utility unit with their Plague of Flies plus Poison. Chaos doesn't have the greatest access to poison on their roster. You've got Poison Hounds, but those rout when glared at. And that's it. So the fact that you've got a Forsaken unit that applies poison, that's fairly sturdy and will stick around okay-ish, and debuffs nearby enemies is really rather nice. And I think there's quite a lot of builds where you can benefit from throwing these guys in as a support option. Certainly not sort of a core unit, but I think there's quite a few matchups where you will bring these guys. I actually might swing them a little higher on this roster. On this lineup, I'd probably put them above Halberds, to be honest. I don't know if I'd put them above Sword and Board Chosen. I really like my Sword and Board Chosen. For me, they're an S tier. No, they're not S tier, but they're very, very good. But I have a soft spot for my beloved Chosen. But yeah, these guys are good, and they bring some utility that normal Forsaken just don't bring to the table. They're still very flimsy in that Forsaken manner. Moving on to Marauder Horseman, and this is going to be a quick, easy tiering in my mind. Marauder Horseman, S tier. Marauder Throwing Axes, in my opinion, B tier, and actually not a super high B tier. I'm sure some people will disagree, but too bad. Marauder Horseman Throwing Axes, in my book, probably get themselves like a low B. I'll put them above Halberds. I think poor Halberds here are getting like overwhelmed. I just don't like Chaos Warrior Halberds that much. I don't think they... I think in most cases where you want that elite Halberd core, you're going to go with Chosen Halberds. And in cases where you want a bit of something a bit wider, you're actually going to go with Chaos Warriors with great weapons. Because they don't, while not doing quite as well against large, they do well enough, and they crump infantry just that bit better. But they're honestly, these guys are not a bad unit. They're just getting overshadowed, pushed down to B. But yeah, Throwing Axes and Horsemasters. And I'm kind of going to do these guys as a lump sum here. Horsemen, staple pick. Dirt cheap skirmish cav that can kind of match units like Pistoliers, Centaur, Throwing Axes, which are a pretty key threat actually. Poke back at Norscan Missile cav. Pressure back Illyrian Reavers. Pressure back Orc skirmish cav. Pressure back Empire Outriders and Outrider grenade launchers. Yada yada. These guys are a cheap cav, that kind of cheap skirmish cav that honestly kind of doubles as a hound unit just to pressure away enemy skirmishers. Now, they're not as good in straight combat, as you're basically always going to see a handful of these guys. I think there's very few Chaos lists where you will not see at least 2 to 3 horsemen. They're just such a core pick. Maybe against dwarves is like the one matchup where you might not see these guys. Horsemasters get themselves an A tier because I think they are better than Throwing Axes. They've got more utility. They've got solid AP, solid damage over time, just because they've got such high AP values. They're still fairly mobile, but they've got decent armor and combat stats. They're essentially the OG Illyrian Reaver. They hit like a truck on the charge for a light cav. They can just trade blow for blow with a lot of units you wouldn't expect them to, and act as a functional combat unit into late game scenarios. Just a very, very strong skirmish cav, but a bit expensive, and that is why they are not getting themselves an S tier. You're not going to see these guys in every build. You can't afford them every build. You can get 3 horsemen for the price of 2 horsemasters. So sometimes you just need that width, and horsemen are good enough to say beat Pistoliers in melee or beat Outriders in melee. You don't need the horsemasters for that. So sometimes numbers just matter, and these guys don't bring that to the table. But a great unit. I really do like them against, say, High Elves, because that extra armor helps a bit against Reaver Harass. And like them quite a bit against Dark Elves, like that extra little bit of range. But fun unit. Definitely like them. Horsemen with Throwing Axes, not bad by any stretch of the imagination, just in my opinion worse than the others. They've got AP, which is nice, so you don't need Plague of Rust to really punch armor. But at the same time, these units both have solid AP values, so the armor piercing isn't that huge of a benefit. My big problem with Horsemen is the missile velocity, the projectile velocity on the Throwing Axes is terrible. And so against flyers, they are dog crap. They will do nothing for you, essentially. A lot of times you try to use these guys against gyrocopters, and the gyrocopter will just float above you, cackling like mad and ignoring you. You try to use these guys against moving cav, and you'll often just be dodged. They do have a bronze shield, actually, so they can shrug off some missile pressure better than, say, Marauder Horsemen. But ultimately, they are just... their low projectile velocity means they just don't perform against the targets you really need them to perform against, which are usually flyers trying to bully your big monsters. As Chaos, because you've got Shaggoths, because you got Kolek, because you got Archaeon and great weapons and all that stuff, usually big armored monsters are not your primary threat. And so these guys just don't have that much value, and when you need to poke away at something that's flying and harassing you, or you need to pressure away enemy skirmishers, you're better off with Horsemen or Horsemasters, or to poke down, say, a Mortis Ascension. These guys just don't perform, but still a solid unit. They can still whittle down Demigryph Knights. They can still pressure armored infantry, chariots, and trade okay into enemy skirmishers just because of those shields. Does move us on to Chariots, which I think are a rather strong suit of Chaos as well. Vanilla Chariots definitely very, very solid. I would rate them as a top tier unit, or one of the upper tier units for Chaos. I'm actually thinking I might put them here above Chosen. Don't know if I put my Chosen Great Weapons. They're a good unit. I think I'll put them here at Chaos Warriors. why do I like Chaos Chariots? Good armor, good speed, and cheap. They're a chariot that costs peanuts, and they can be used to screen out Chameleon Skinks, for example, very efficiently. You don't want to screen Chameleon Skinks with Marauder Horseman. You'll get shot to crap. You don't want to do it with Chaos Knights. They're too expensive, and they're going to get mucked up. Plus, they're actually not that quick, so they tend to get snared and bogged down and blocked for way too long. Use a chariot. It costs 750 gold. It will eventually catch those Chameleon Skinks. And yeah, it'll take a boatload of damage. You might lose a model, but who really cares? It's a fairly cheap investment. And it will do the job where hounds will fail. It will do the job where knights are just too expensive. A great disrupt tool, great for just throwing into a backline because it's just so cheap and expendable, while being a fairly tanky unit. Kind of envision it like Empire Knights, honestly. That's kind of what it's like to use Chaos Chariots. They're obviously not as good against large targets or multi-entity large targets like cavalry as Empire Knights are, but much better against infantry, and don't tend to bleed as much models. So kind of a disruptive blocking force and zoning force, and I really like them for that. They get a B tier. Razor Gores, not so much. Expensive chariot unit that once again overlaps with a lot that Chaos already does well. Chaos beats down infantry pretty well, so especially if you're preparing to fight armor and heavy infantry, odds are you can use Chosen great weapons, or you can use Chosen with some support, or you got trolls or whatever. You got options. That doesn't mean Razor Gores are bad though. In my book, they get themselves a middling C tier here as well. They hit pretty hard. They're very beefy with 130, I believe, armor nowadays. A bit slow, but they do cause fear. They are very hard to put down, and all in all, solid chariot can bring the pain train for sure. It's just that they don't have the universality of a Chaos Chariot. You can't use them to screen out skirmishers or something. You don't want to be doing that. They're too expensive. They're also slow. So at 66 speed, I believe the Chaos Chariot gets 78. So these guys actually, if you're chasing Chameleon Skinks, for example, with these guys, they'll waste so much time trying to close the gap. They'll almost never close that gap, whereas Chariots will. But Razor Gores definitely are not Razor Gores. Gore Beast Chariots definitely not bad. C tier there for mulching infantry. Chaos Knights. Now, I gave a glowing review to in the last one, and I kind of am tempted to do so again, just because I personally like Chaos Knights. But at the same time, I think it's unfair. Though I've been trying to make these a bit more of a universal tier list rather than just my tier list. I think it's unfair to put Chaos Knights that high because ultimately they're not that meta of a unit, and they are overshadowed by better options. Chaos Knights generally suffer from the fact that Chaos already mulches infantry really well, and if you need to fight large, you've got way better mobile options like Dragon Ogres, Shaggoths, and so on. That doesn't make them bad units, though. I'm going to put both in a similar position here. I'm going to put both at a lower C tier here, so a little mid-ish C tier. Maybe actually below the Sorcerer, I don't know. This is a bit of a middling goop of units. I personally like Chaos Knights with Sword and Board a little better, actually, just because they grind really well. They've got really good sustained combat stats, but and they don't require as much micro. So if you're a bad player with micro, like me, you will enjoy Chaos Knights with Sword and Board better because you can play like a potato and still get some value out of them. They're essentially almost Chosen on horseback, which is pretty neat. That's the Lance Brethren here. They hit a lot harder if you drop a Plague of Rust on, say, Demigryphs and then hit them with Lance Knights. Not a good time for Demis. They'll probably cry and be very sad and get run over. But I do actually like using Knights against High Elves, for example. Factions that don't necessarily have the best options as far as AP goes. Not terrible against Empire if you support them properly. But ultimately, in most situations, I prefer using other units as Chaos to counter large. And that is what ultimately kills them for me. I like them against Wood Elves, actually. Good sort of pressure unit. We bring a handful of these guys, plus some Exalted Champions, plus Sorcerer or something. And you can really pressure the enemy very aggressively with a lot of horsemen and dogs and Chaos Knights and just bring an overwhelming mob to swarm your opponent. And Chaos Knights definitely perform well there. But very expensive, very limited in function, very much oriented at killing infantry, which everything else on the Chaos roster already does. Ultimately kind of kills them and limits their viability to C tier. Swords of Chaos, unfortunately, in my book, get a D tier. Not a terrible unit. on paper at least, but ultimately they're an elite cav on a roster that has no healing. They don't have any missile resist, they don't have any physical resist, so they lose models to cannonballs. Fire damage makes them worthless against high elves. If you've ever seen these guys fight Fireborn, it's a hilarious engagement, but very one-sided. Not super quick, though they do get Apocalyptic Charge. They also get Guardian, which gives you a bit more of Archaeon or Kolek. They can synergize pretty well as a bodyguard unit, and that's really the main reason they get themselves a D tier rather than going down to F or something. In specific matchups, you can combo these guys with, say, Archaeon or Kolek, and while one of these characters dishes out the pain, these guys block the enemy from surrounding them and just hold their ground and give you 15% more Archaeon or 15% more Kolek with their physical resist. So, or with the Guardian aura. So, not a terrible unit, honestly. If it was on, say, Empire roster, maybe it would see more value use because you could heal them. But as it stands on Chaos roster, unfortunately, just not able to find themselves a niche, really. So I think a high D for them. They're definitely just a very niche unit. Which brings us on to dogs. Warhounds, not particularly good. Probably also a D tier unit, to be honest. They're not terrible. It's just that you're going to bring Poison Warhounds basically every time you bring these guys. Poison Warhounds get themselves an easy A. It really isn't a judgment on the unit's individual prowess, honestly. You pay 75 more gold for Poison, but you usually want Poison. The Warhounds do is help you snare enemies to force them to fight your large, or force them to fight, say, your halberds, and otherwise harass backlines and disrupt your opponent's skirmishers. And having Poison helps. It helps keep them locked in place. It helps against skirmish cav like Outriders, for example. They can't escape to begin with. They double can't escape when you hit them with Poison. So Warhounds with Poison get themselves an A tier. You basically only bring Warhounds when you don't have the money to bring Warhounds with Poison. And in many cases, if you're going to bring Warhounds, if you're just going to bring a non-Poison disruption unit, you're actually better off bringing Marauder Horseman. Because Marauder Horseman, for 100 gold more, granted, are a comparable combat unit to Chaos Warhounds and have javelins. So they've got much more universality. In my opinion, dogs are just kind of pushed out by the skirmish cav. Chaos skirmish cav being so decent and so solid in melee makes dogs a bit redundant. I actually might push Poison Hounds down a bit here, now that I think about it. Put them down to B. Yeah, they might deserve a B, to be honest. Sad doggo noises, but yeah, honestly a B. Because ultimately as Chaos, you will usually bring the handful of these guys to screen for your horsemen or whatever. Maybe they should be A just for that, because you bring these guys usually. They can be an A, whatever. They can support your skirmish cav in a melee fight, but ultimately, because your skirmish cav is so self-sufficient, you don't need just a combat light cav, which is basically what dogs are. You either want something to bring some utility with Poison, or just go with Marauder Horseman. Going on to Manticores. Now, this is a unit I really hated on in the last video, and a unit I'm not very fond of still, but it has grown on me a little bit. I respect its capabilities a little more. I'm going to give it a very low C. It's a cheap source of terror and a cheap source of disruption, and that is not easy for Chaos to come by. Basically, your only options there are Marauders, Marauder Horsemen, and Dogs, and most of those units are rout and glared at. And are fairly easy to zone. Manticore's kind of hard to zone, so because it flies. So it can be a good disruption tool. Generally, I prefer to have a character mounted on a Manticore if I can afford it, or if I've got that slot open. But if not, Manticore can do the job. Definitely, it can be a disruptive force. Just throw it into the back line and watch it go ham on your opponent. Send some bodies flying. And for that, it's going to get itself a C tier as a cheap throwaway disruptor. Trolls. I basically never see vanilla Trolls in Chaos. I don't want to give them an F tier because they're not a terrible unit. They synergize okay with Archaeon. But honestly, you basically never see them, so low D for them. I think they actually might have... last time I gave them an F because I felt that they never see use. But I don't know if they're that bad, but they are. You basically never see them in serious competitive builds because armored trolls, who are just a little bit further down on the list, are just so much more useful for not too much more gold. Yeah, Chaos Trolls, do you ever use them in any matchup? If you guys use Chaos Trolls in any matchup, let me know. Because I can't think of any build where that wasn't meant to be troll-centric, where I brought Chaos Trolls. I can think of builds that I did just for fun, but not like serious competitive builds where I'd bring Chaos Trolls. So I don't... For me, they're a D tier. The things they can do, act as a blocker unit, just act as a source of massive raw DPS on the front line, and ultimately overwhelm backlines can be done better, in my opinion, by armored trolls who are just more resilient to damage and thus don't rout as easily, just because they don't take as much leadership hurt either. When you take less damage, you take less leadership pain. So D tier for trolls. Chaos Spawn, I think, are okay nowadays. They got cheaper, which is nice. Not as good as Beastmen Chaos Spawn because they do not have poison, but a respectable unit regardless. I think they do get themselves on the upper end of C tier. You can send them scurrying alongside your Marauders or your Aspiring Champions or whatever, just looking to disrupt and break enemy backlines or front lines and overwhelm squishy infantry quickly, flailing around with their tentacles and monstrous arms and crap. They do a lot of hurt to lightly armored infantry. So against Skaven, for example, very solid choice. They can be utilized against Beastmen, against Tomb Kings, units like that. Not perhaps a top tier unit pick, but they have their uses. Which brings us to Armored Trolls, which are in a similar boat. I think they're also a niche unit. I'm going to give them a upper C again. Armor makes them lose leadership less, makes them trade better into spears, which are traditionally a nasty counter to trolls, makes them trade a lot better into heavy cav, which traditionally something like Knights of the Blazing Sun are a nightmare for trolls. But even stone trolls have to respect Knights of the Blazing Sun because 70 armor isn't that much. But these guys with 110 armor that comes from the 3 plates on their shoulder are pretty damn beefy. They can take a few hits and keep ticking, so they get a C tier. Good unit. They get support from Archaeon in there with Crown of Domination, which is usually how you bring them, and they will stick around through thick and thin. Definitely a useful unit. Definitely a C. Easy reason to bring it. Put them at C, even if niche. Say you might bring them against dwarves where you're not expecting fear and terror. They can be an all right choice there. I've seen them against Greenskins or Norska occasionally, Norska especially. You can even bring them against Beastmen if you really want to. There's a few matchups that can perform pretty well. Giants, not a huge fan of this unit. They're very easy to focus down with missiles. Gonna get a very low C for me. There's a handful of matchups. I like them against Greenskins just because they're either a massive missile magnet or they will help you grind out the front line fight, which is normally difficult otherwise. They're okay against vampire counts, which is otherwise a pretty tough matchup. So they can act as an HP pool just to soak damage and trade blows with big monsters like Terrorgeists because they just have so much HP to utilize. I'm kind of struggling to think of any other matchups so where I'd really want a giant, and I'm halfway tempted to push them back down to D tier. Maybe they should be D tier. Yeah, I think they're probably D tier. I might have been a little over optimistic putting them at C. They're a D tier unit. Who am I kidding? Not terrible, but Chaos isn't the best roster for disrupting backlines. They're not necessarily like Beastmen or Norska who can really overrun their opponent's backline or Greenskins and enable a giant. So the giants kind of fall off there. Which moves us on to Dragon Ogres, another great unit, another unit of excellence. Easily getting towards the upper end of this list. Same with Shaggus, in fact. I'm on the fence a little bit about whether they should be A or B. I actually think I'll put them at A because these guys don't have as much. I don't know. No, B probably because Summoner's Rage are a thing. Let's say here. I think that's fair. Dragon Ogres. Why do I like them? Surprisingly tanky against missiles, especially AP missiles, because they've got pretty high HP. They've got missile resist. They've got some mobility, certainly not great, but decent. Bonus versus large. They hit pretty hard against cavalry. They hit pretty hard against big monsters. There's only 12 models, so they're kind of difficult to zone out. You can combine them with dogs and really set up some great engagements and great grind fights on the flanks. Just a solid unit. The very high HP people on these guys is really nifty. They just grind for days, and it can cause serious issues for your opponent. They bleed with models, unlike Chariots. They don't cause terror, so they are susceptible to that. They're very expensive at 1700, and as a result, you'll often bring Summoners of Rage instead, which is one of the reasons they're actually locked in here at B tier. I think if Summoners of Rage weren't a thing, these guys would probably see more usage. But as it stands, I think they're good in matchups such as Empire. They're good in matchups such as Bretonnia, though against Bretonnia, almost anything goes. They can be solid against Lizardmen. They can be solid in those sorts of matchups. They can perform a rather valuable function and get themselves a B tier there for that. Shaggoth, I'm actually going to give an A tier to. Low A, certainly not. Maybe it actually deserves a high B. Good single entity to bring against the Lizardmen, against Vampire Counts, against Tomb Kings, against Empire. You can bring them as long as you screen it decently. Good against High Elves because they struggle. Even though it's got only 70 armor rather than the 100 on Kolek, the 25% missile resist still adds up. It's a pretty beefy boy. Good against Norska. Good against Beast. It's really good in most matchups that aren't sort of missile dominated. Like probably not something you want against Wood Elves or against Dwarves or against Vampire Coast. Probably not the biggest brain decision there, but against other factions it can do rather well. Much more mobile than say a Giant, so you can get out of dodge of bad situations better. And unlike Dragon Ogre Shaggoths, you don't bleed models. You can deliver full blows to single entities, you cause terror, so it's nice to have a terror-causing monster, especially if you route, say, Archaeon, and you don't have terror otherwise, or Sigvald. Good choice there. Which moves us on to Regiments of Renown, and first we've got the Weird Spawn, Regiment of Renown Chaos Spawn, which I think are great. Another C tier unit, and the B tier unit, and that is quite a fleshed out tier now. Once again, a niche, a sort of situational utility unit. They bring armor sundering, and they bring better combat stats. Combat stats not so important, but they are a bit beefier with physical resist. Not too much more expensive than a Chaos Spawn. And Armor Sundering synergizes excellently with especially Mirror Guard, Forsaken, or Chosen. And they can really grind down an enemy front line, which normally relies on armor pretty well. You get these guys alongside, say, Chosen against an enemy core unit that they're relying on to hold the line, say some Saurus or some Temple Guard. Suddenly their armor is in the gutter, and those Chosen are hewing through them very quickly, and it's an ugly situation. Or even if you have these guys on top of, say, some Marauders, and they're just whittling, dropping unit stats, you can then have some Horsemen swing around the flank and whittle that unit down. If they catch a big monster, like you can drop a unit like a Star Dragon from 80 armor to 50 with the Weird Spawn. And when you think about that, that's going from an average of 60% damage mitigation to non-AP down to an average of 37.5, not even 40% damage mitigation. So you're doing a lot more damage. And the Weird Spawn themselves benefit from this because they're a non-AP unit, so they actually get perks from that too. So all in all, a really good support unit. Obviously not something you're always going to bring just because they're kind of expensive, and ultimately they are non-AP, and Chaos Spawn don't have the best combat stats, especially against missiles, but an easy B tier, I think, and you're going to bring them most of the time if you bring Chaos Spawn. Which does move us on to Summoners of Rage. In my mind, an easy A tier. I'm sure some people would even put these guys at S tier. I'm gonna be mean here. I'm gonna put them towards the top of A. Magic damage is amazing. Dragon Ogres have good baseline stats. These guys have gooder combat stats because they're rank 9. Magic damage makes them great against Bretonnia. Makes them good against High Elves. Makes them honestly good against any factions where you're expecting physical resist. Even Empire can sometimes throw out like a Shield of Thorns or something, and these guys will do well against that. Just not good against Volkmar and the Fey Enchantress. So you got to anticipate that you need something else to deal with it. But yeah, magic damage on these guys are really nifty. And they have a Bound Chain Lightning, which can wipe out some cheap trash squads every now and then. So all in all, good unit, easy A tier. If you're going to bring Dragon Ogres, then odds are you're going to bring these guys first and foremost. And then normal Dragon Ogres are supplement. So very good unit. Which brings us on to the last and probably least well-utilized portion of the Chaos roster, though it gets used. And that is the artillery. And, of course, that's just the Hell Cannon and its Regiment of Renown. Yeah, let's see. Lost my train of thought there for a second. But the Hell Cannon, vanilla version, I'm going to give it a D tier. A low D. The reason for that is, one, it's got a very low ammo capacity, unlike the Regiment of Renown. And that hurts. Because if you miss a few shots on the normal Hell Cannon, it quickly adds up. The amount of damage you missed out on. You can oftentimes expend your ammo pool and then have a useless artillery piece just sitting around when you could have paid just a couple hundred more for the Regiment of Renown artillery piece and done better damage to yeah, you could have just spent more money on the Regiment of Renown and gotten more value. If you had happened to do a weird double Hell Cannon build, maybe you'll bring this unit. But ultimately, yeah, Regiment of Renown just outshines it. It's a better unit in general to bring. So that's kind of all there is to it. And we're really going to focus on the Regiment of Renown here, which I think gets itself a low B. The reason for that, in matchups such as High Elves, it can be excellent for blasting apart infantry formations. If you can hide it behind a berm in specific maps, then it can be very good against several factions. You can just chip away at enemy infantry. It's got, I believe it's called Eater of Souls or something. As its ability, I forget what the name of the ability is called, but it triggers when your opponent comes within a certain range of it, and within I believe 150 meter range or so, and it massively increases the rate of fire on this unit. So you can suddenly just be spewing out fireball after fireball after fireball and really quickly mulch some infantry. Excellent against Bretonnia for breaking up pox arrows before they can reach the main fight. Excellent against High Elves to kill off Sisters of Avalorn or key elite infantry. Excellent against... They can be good against Empire or Dwarves or even Vampire Coast if you do have a berm to hide behind, if it's a map that's designed like that. Nowadays, a bit tougher to use against Wood Elves because Wood Elves have a lot of flyers with 360-degree fire, which is kind of annoying. But at one point, it was a decent choice against Wood Elves. Maybe it still is if you've got the right micro for it. But a very respectable unit, in my opinion, and it gets itself an easy B. So that is it for the Chaos Regiment of Renown. And everything from Hell Cannons to Archaeon. And, well, let me know what you guys think. Do you guys agree with this tier list? Do you guys think it's ridiculous? Do you think it's there's units that should be moved around, or units that were treated too harshly or too well? Let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. I will respond as soon as I can. As always, I do thank you all for watching. Do thank you all for all the support. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.